think the mic is, oh, it may be muted. No, I'm on. Yeah. Okay. All right. I think we're good to go. It's 11:30 on the dot. Thank you for being here. Not as if you had a choice, though. But hopefully we give you a good hour today. Special treat, we've been able to have Ambassador Rick Barton with decades of experience with the DIME, as we call it here, including diplomacy, development, economics, as well as interacting with the M. Rick Barton I'm not going to go in sequential order, rather I'm going to hit what I think are the high points that directly connect to IS-1 and IS-2 that you've taken here, as well as some of the other courses. First of all, the UN. He's had two roles. He was Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees in Geneva in Switzerland for a time. He was also one of several ambassadors to the Economic and Social Council at the UN in New York, is that right? Which has agencies like UNDP, UNICEF, and so on. And on the American side, and I plan to end the exchange today with this because it gets to the whole organizational culture thing and standing up countercultural SOPs. On our side, under Madeleine Albright, he was tasked to stand up an all-new sort of countercultural Office of Transition Initiatives at USAID. The context there is that up to that point, there were two divisions in USAID, humanitarian aid in very conflictual areas, think hotspot areas, weak and fragile states or failed states, or on the other end of the spectrum, full-scale peacetime development, and there was a vacuum in between those two ends, and the OTI fit in that vacuum. The other thing which he personally stood up in 2011, more than a decade later, was the the Conflict Stabilization Operations Bureau.
Yes.
Yes, and I'm forgetting the acronyms. But so he's had experience sort of battling it out within organizations, in the interagency, and also seeing the forest for the trees, or what we've been teaching you all the way from grand strategy down to tactics. So with that, and I almost forgot the important thing here, which is that if you go to Amazon, just saying.
We'll check tomorrow.
Yes. But no, he just came out with a book in 2018. He is a professor at Princeton now, so had actually some time away from the field and away from the bureaucratic desk to actually write down thoughts from his career spanning 40 different conflict areas in the world. And it's called Peace Works, America's Unifying Role in a Turbulent World. So with that, thank you for being here.
Great, thank you for all of you for being here by choice. And it's really a pleasure. Thank you. I know many people thank you for being great public servants, whether you're in the military or the civilian side, and I certainly add my thanks to that. And also thank you for your curiosity and for your constant learning, because this is a pretty complex world, and once you think you've got it knocked, you're probably falling behind. So it's great to have you here, and thank you for including me in this day.
Okay, and that's actually a great segue to my first question. In your book, you really, I think, keep hitting effectively through case studies on the point that whether it's the top of the government all the way down to the bottom, whether it's one agency or several agencies coming together in an interagency process, we do very poorly at assessing the environment the target environment in which we're intervening. We have trouble understanding the cause-effect, understanding who the society or body is that we're interacting with. And I was wondering if you could talk to that. Why is that the case? How is it that, whether it's an individual agency or several acting together, we keep sort of getting the cultural intelligence wrong?
Well, it really is the original sin problem. If you don't know a place and you don't know the people in the place, how helpful can you really be? And if you take a situation like the Gaza Strip, where the Israelis really ran it for years. It's about the size of this room. But then they gave it up and decided to invade it a few years later, and they were completely shocked by what happened to them. They got stuck, all kinds of things happened, and yet they had every conceivable advantage that a non-local might have. They actually had been in charge of it. They knew many local officials. They had all kinds of knowledge. So then when you get into a country like Vietnam that I visited a year ago, and there's 91 million people, and it stretches out as long as our West Coast, and you start to realize, whew, this could be pretty difficult. So the first mistake I think we make is, and this is made really across the board, is we lack humility about how much we don't know. When I got briefed as an Assistant Secretary of State, I would get sort of a high-level briefing every Wednesday, and the briefing might be about Libya that day, or I could get a mixed briefing, but oftentimes I'd focus in on a subject, and I would have the senior-most people in our intelligence community coming in to brief me, and I would often say, "You're the smartest person in the U.S. government about this particular subject. On a scale of 1 to 10, where do you think you are?" And the really great briefers would say, maybe 3 or 4, 10 being the best. If somebody told you 8 or 9, you knew they were hallucinating. But it's just that, so it has to start with that humility, and then you have to have an insatiable curiosity. And I mean, this is my first visit to Alabama. So guess what I got to do today? I got to have breakfast downtown. Last night we had dinner downtown, but I got to walk up to the state capitol, see the portraits of a bunch of governors, and see where they seceded from the United States, stop at the Civil Rights Museum. And I'm hoping to do a little bit more of that, because I know nothing about Montgomery. I don't know really very much about Alabama, and I want to know a heck of a lot more. So that curiosity, that insatiable need to know more, I would say, is something we have to really reward in a very big way. And then I would say we also probably don't direct our talent quite as well as we should. So one of the questions that I ask American audiences, as I have a chance to meet with people like this, like you, is if you had a choice of spending $500 million for a new fancy embassy in Baghdad, or $500 million to train 500 Americans, $1 million each, to be comfortable with the language, the culture, the history, the religion, everything else that's going on in the place, which would you do? And 95% plus of American audiences, it doesn't matter if I'm at Bob Jones University or Berkeley, they answer the same thing. They would want to invest in the 500 Americans who could really operate and understand the place. Now, the bad news is, I'm here to report that we have a new embassy in Baghdad.
It was 700 million.
And the really bad news is, it originally was planned to be a $500 million embassy, and it's a $700 million embassy. And that was the one that you read about or heard about or followed just a few weeks ago that had been attacked. And it's very hard for our diplomats or our soldiers or anybody else who's at that embassy to get off campus. So you have kind of a gated community or walled embassy, whatever you want to call it. So these are choices that we have to make, and one of the ideas that I hope that I'll really build in the course of this conversation with you is that we have choices, that we don't have to be Americans on tourist visas when we're talking about wars. We can actually have a heck of a lot more influence, and I want to get back to that, I hope.
And you, last night over dinner, you said you had your own version of the Powell Doctrine. Could you?
Yeah, so I don't know, how many people here have ever heard of the Powell Doctrine? Yeah, okay. So I've got my Powell Doctrine too, which is, if we don't know 100 people in a place, please don't send a US soldier. That would have probably slowed up some of our enthusiasm in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq, which are obviously three very, very, very big challenges that have been that our country faced. And I think wherever you sit on the historical or current events side of things, we could probably all agree that we could do it better. Some people might be more critical, but my view is there's always room for improvement, and in those cases, big time. And the first place to start is know the people of the place and make sure you're responsive to what they say is most important, not what you necessarily have in the warehouse or what you did in Bosnia or this really worked back in the Civil War, because it's really important to be current, tuned, and informed.
And you said as well, I remember you said knowing the finance minister or the prime minister's brother doesn't count in that 100.
I prefer that you not get all of your bodies out of the three branches of the government that you're most likely to be assigned to work with. You don't get that. You don't get extra credit for knowing the taxi driver or the Uber driver either. That's not bad, but again, want to see people getting out and being in touch with the local community.
So you actually have recommendations in your book for how the interagency can better collaborate or equip itself to get to know a conflict environment in one of these fragile state areas. You called them complex emergencies. Often they're man-made emergencies, not a typhoon, but atrocities of some sort or a civil war. How can, using the tools we have right now, or maybe changing some of the tools, how can our agencies come together better to get situational awareness?
Well, it's really a good challenge, because we do tend to all go into our spaces and follow our spaces. And maybe I can make my point by telling a story that when I was at USAID, the administrator of AID, who would be the number one official, top official, asked me to represent the agency at the deputies level of the National Security Council. So that would be the second highest level, not the secretaries of state or the administrator of AID, but the second highest level. So I got a chance to sit there with General Ralston, and who was the deputy at the Defense Department at that time, and probably, I guess, maybe he was the deputy of the Joint Chiefs at that time. But every meeting pretty much started the same way, and there was a certain pattern that developed. So we got between Christmas and New Year's, kind of a shadow time where everybody's not on the job. And the acting Secretary of State, who was coming to the meeting, Tom Pickering, one of the most distinguished ambassadors, wasn't able to get into the White House that day because they had his Social Security number wrong. So he's the acting Secretary of State, and he's out on the street. And we're waiting for him inside the room, and we're hearing that he's having trouble getting in. That's a bit of a laughable moment. I mean, it does seem absurd, at least it did to us. But one of the people at the table said, well, we got an extra 10 minutes. Why don't we each do each other's reports? Well, we've been there meeting for some time, and it seemed like a fun idea. And so somebody said, I'll be the intelligence community, and it always starts with an intelligence report. And so the briefer start off, the fake briefer start off, and he said, Kosovo is going to hell and it's not getting any better. And that seemed pretty much the report that we'd heard every week for several months. And so then the State Department person spoke up and said, it's been very nice, it's been a good meeting. We'll go back to the State Department and we'll write the report. Of course, there'd been no conversation yet. Nothing had happened. And then the Pentagon person said, and the Pentagon it's lucky, it doesn't usually just get one seat, it gets the Secretary of Defense seat, it gets the Joint Chiefs seat, and oftentimes the head of the intelligence person is a military person as well. So there's a slight weighting. I mean, if you're an American and you're looking for majority rules, well, they can the Pentagon shows up with its own majority sometimes. So if there's somebody who's just running, do I have the votes on this? The votes tend to be so this is something to keep in mind as well. But the Pentagon person said, yeah, thank you very much for all of your opinions. We'll take it back to our building and let you know. So, which is exactly what happens many, many times. It's like buying a car. I mean, are you selling me the car, or is the manager, or is the manager's manager? I mean, how am I gonna get the deal? And then AID spoke up and said, please don't take our money. So that was pretty much the meeting. But these cultures really dominate. I mean, these cultures can really stay with it and have a huge influence. And my belief is the model we need to move towards is much more the U.S. Embassy model. It's one of the cleanest structures in the U.S. government. When you go to a foreign country, the U.S. Embassy is the center of gravity. The ambassador, in theory, is the CEO. Now, when you get several thousand U.S. soldiers showing up, it gets a little bit less clear. But nevertheless, the president's representative in the country is supposed to be the ambassador. And the only reason, and it works quite often, you have to have a good ambassador. And you have to have a great country team, and people have to feel like they're part of the team. And if you have the right ambassador, that happens. But in Washington, you don't have this kind of clarity at all. So what ends up happening is people end up coming with their views of their own institutions and their own cultures. And then to actually get a working session or to get a decision made can be really tough. And I believe too often people then look to the National Security Council or to the White House for that tiebreaker, when a lot of times, those of us, even at whatever level you're at, should be making some decisions and should be moving these things along and shouldn't be pushing up something that's very fundamental to the top levels of our government. Because guess what? They have other jobs to do. I mean, even when we have a big problem like Afghanistan on the table, there still are other things that the White House is worried about. And these are, so pushing those decisions out, and it's initially in how we engage in a country that we get people out into the field and we hear lots and lots and lots and lots of local voices. And by the way, it's not hard to do 1,000 interviews with Afghans if you train 12 Afghans for about 2 weeks and you get them out there and you do those interviews, and you can use handheld technology these days and you can get quite complicated ideas. You don't have to be on a survey. What town do you live in? No, you can ask somebody, tell me something. How are you doing? And they say, I'm doing pretty well. Any problems? Well, no, my daughter's going to school. How's that working? Well, most days it works pretty well, but I'm worried about acid being thrown in her face. Oh, now have we learned something about safety and security in the course of about a 47-second conversation? You bet. If you talk to a local official, you say, how does it feel to be the first elected mayor of your town here in Colombia in the last X number of years? And they said, I really like it. I came back here. I didn't expect to be elected mayor. It's the honor of a lifetime. Any problems? There have been 5 assassination attempts on my life in the last 6 months. Huh. Okay, so something good is happening. We're opening up the country to a new system of government. Something very complicated is happening. There's still a heck of a lot of insecurity in the countryside, and it hasn't been accepted by the various rebel forces that this is the way things are going to operate. So this kind of stuff is readily available, but it has to be brought together, and we have to have a common view in the U.S. government. That seldom happens, but it's not impossible, and I've seen it. I've seen it work, and that's one reason I wrote this book, is to give people a sense of what we have to do, but also a sense of hope that it's not that hard.
Well, and you overwhelmingly focus
on not strong states or peer competitors, but societies or environments that are defined by endemic violence or the endemic threat of violence, civil violence, civic violence, however you want to term it. And you say that we have trouble, let me get beyond assessing the situation, even if we get an accurate picture of the situation, we have trouble getting purchase and finding our niche with our capabilities. What should our policy goals be? Because we've been teaching them in IS2 about everything goes back to policy objectives, but you raise the point, even if we assess what's going on in the society, we get it 80, 90% right, it's hard to come to agreement between agencies or the president or whoever. This is our goal we wish to accomplish in this complex situation. Again, how can our government do better in arriving at concrete, discrete, you call it humble and realistic goals?
Yeah. Well, one of the things I learned in Haiti was that what they would say is, what is the priority of priorities? I love that, because when you send a United Nations mission, the U.S. government's not that different. Guess what? We're the biggest member of that club, so we have some influence on how the UN works. We send a UN mission down following a very difficult problem in Haiti, and there are likely to be 40 members of the mission, and each of them has their own specialty: HIV/AIDS, food, whatever it happens to be. And guess what you come back with? You come back with a shining city on a hill kind of design, which tries to do everything at once. Now, a lot of this stuff, my feeling is we don't do a lot of this stuff that well in the United States, let alone in a place which has got a heck of a lot more disadvantages than we have. So why would we set as our model that we're going to build a shining city on a hill in these places? My belief is that what we should be is we should be attuned to the people, see what they offer, where's their energy, and then be catalytic so we help them actually do 2 or 3 highly achievable but most desirable objectives. So don't get yourself off on something that, again, is what you do well, because that does not necessarily speak to what they want. And at the end of the day, I don't know how you are, but I can speak quite modestly about my own influence on the people that love me most. So if my daughter asks me for advice, or my wife asks me for advice, or let's say friends, they're probably, I don't get that high a hit rate. When I was in business, I used to say that my clients would listen to me 27% of the time. I think I do better at home. So why would somebody in a war-torn area who's just being killed by their neighbor or being threatened by their neighbor, why would they be all ears and action for something that so again, just that calibrating can make a difference. And the priority of priorities is usually quite apparent. And it's also oftentimes has a heavily political component to it. So people seek neutrality and want to be fair to both sides, but you have to make choices in these places. And that's what a lot of politics is about. Why politics is so difficult is that many of the toughest decisions are things that people don't all agree upon. That there might be a 51-49 division on it. And in particular in a place where so many people have fled, have been killed, have been injured, or whatever else it happens to be. So I try to make sure that we're attentive to the people, and then we focus in on what they said most. Now, for example, let me just give you one example. And it's a tough one because we weren't able to address it. I probably spoke to a couple hundred Syrians working on the Syrian, early days of the Syrian revolution. And the one thing that every Syrian I spoke to, the very first thing that they said was, stop the bombing. And they would say that for 15 minutes easily, because they knew that if they could fight fairly against the regime, the Assad regime, they could win the revolution. They had the popular support. But between barrel bombs and missiles and shelling and the flattening of cities, they were not in a competitive position. And we never really addressed that issue. And in my book, I talk about some ways that I thought we could have. I'll go into them later if you like. But you do have to be responsive. If you're going to listen and you're going to be attentive, then you have to at least acknowledge, at the very least acknowledge, that this is the biggest issue. And are we being as creative as we can to get at it?
And you mentioned catalytic role, and forgive me if I don't get this exactly right, but you said that you could actually, without tweaking the structure too much, create teams of cross-agency teams to compete with each other for proposals for policy objectives and their solutions.
Yeah, I thought when I was in the think tank world for a few years, I really got a chance to step back and just literally think about my work. So that's a huge luxury, which we don't all get. And I was working on Pakistan because at that time, Pakistan was considered, this was after we'd done a lot of work on Iraq and Afghanistan. But Pakistan was considered the world's most dangerous nation by the United States at that time. Volatile, nuclear weapons, changing governments, terrorists. It had a lot to concern us, and it didn't feel as if we really necessarily knew what was going on in Pakistan. Help me out here. Just refresh the question a second. I want to make sure.
You mentioned in your book creating 2 or 3 competing cross-agency teams.
Yeah, so I got it. So Pakistan seemed to be a place that we shouldn't just count on one team to determine what is going on in the place. It's way too complicated. It's, again, 150, 200 million people, huge country, much bigger than any of these other boutiques that we'd been engaged in. And I thought that if I was the president or advising the president, I would want to have some competing views. And I would actually set up 2 or 3 teams, not as red teams, and I'm sure you've all been reading about red teams, but really as individual teams that would be under the potential leader of whatever you're going to end up doing in the country. So not just the planning group, because I believe the planning and the execution have got to be brought together pretty closely. And one way you do that oftentimes is you give direct responsibility into the next step. And so I thought that if you could send 2 or 3 teams out for as long as 6 months to really operate in the country and hire local people and do the full research, then you would, and have them present to you what they think is going on in the country and what they think should be done. That's a pretty healthy competition. It would probably cost a couple of $1 million and maybe 15 senior talented people, as opposed to going into a place where we spend $100 billion a year and we've never achieved that kind of knowledge. And that's actually what we ended up, one of the products that I ended up working on was developing a measure of progress for Afghanistan, because people were constantly saying we're doing well, we're not doing so well. And I thought, well, why don't we see if we could create a baseline, and then if you don't have a baseline, you can't really tell if you're improving, and then see how things are going, and try to prepare it in a way that if the President of the United States did not have a deep interest and was only going to spend 5 minutes with you, that he would actually get a much better sense of what was going on, rather than being told we built 12 new courthouses. By the way, there are no judges. We built 75 new schools. Nobody can pay to go to school. I mean, these are the kinds of measures that we've used over and over again, and they just are not valid for what's going on. So I thought competing on the collecting of information, competing on the ideas for what you need to do. I mean, it seems to me like it's royally American to have competing ideas. I don't know how you feel, but you're probably thinking about what you're going to have for dinner. You probably have two choices at least. So we're used to it, but that's not the way it necessarily works. We in the foreign policy universe, we move way too fast to what is a false consensus, and then people have to take things back to their buildings or hold on to their money or resist in other passive-aggressive ways, which don't produce the kinds of results that I think we're capable of in these places.
And I just wanted to get to one last point, which is the culture of State Department before we go into Q&A.
Sure.
For about 25 minutes. When I was talking to you last night, you contrasted OTI with Office of Transition Initiatives and set up for Madeleine Albright, 94 to 97, with your travails doing something similar but bigger at the State Department with the CSO, Conflict Stabilization Operations. And just quickly, OTI at USAID, you were given a full remit to invent something new, this middle ground between crisis humanitarian relief in a conflictual country and normal development aid, which, as you pointed out, normal USAID development could take 12 to 36, or 2 to 3 years.
24 to 36 months.
24 to 36 months to figure out what development project they want to do. And these societies need results now. And you found a culture in USAID, and we had Susan Reichley out here who did say USAID has more in common with the culture of the military in terms of can-do attitude, resourcefulness, inventing new solutions, and you were able over 3 years to implant a new culture of not we have a product to push, but rather what does this society need right now, and let's deliver it. Can you contrast that with the State Department, what you ran into with institutional culture, with the CSO,
Sure.
and you had that spectrum for me last night?
Sure, yeah, so I mean, to set a culture, I think it takes 5 years. To set a bureaucratic way, it takes 3 years. That's if you're giving blood every day. I mean, it doesn't happen easily. You really got to stick with it. But it was 5 years, just to not be immodest about that. And that's still, but I think that, I mean, the initial challenge is to diagnose your own institution and to see what's missing. And so the State Department, Secretary of State Clinton, preceded by Secretary of State Rice and Secretary of State Powell, all felt that the State Department was too much of an old-fashioned fire department. That it was really good at when a fire started, people loved to get into the red wagons and drive across town and report on what was going on and maybe get somebody else to jump in the fire. So that was the State Department's reputation, and it wasn't as agile as the secretaries wanted it to be. So they really came up with this idea, we've got to create a new institution that's not going to be driven by geography, which is the dominant institutional structure in the State Department. If you're a young officer in the State Department and you want to become a career ambassador, it really helps you to have champions in your geographic bureau, in the appropriate geographic bureau. That's how you're going to end up as the ambassador to Benin or the ambassador to Brazil or whatever it happens to be. So in both cases, I was able to create an office and then a bureau that was not driven by geography and did not have a set product. So I would not arrive at a scene and say, this is a conventional fire. I could see what was going on. And that was highly, highly, highly unusual. What I would say about the critical cultural challenges of the State Department, in direct answer to your question, is that the State Department is the oldest bureaucracy in the United States government. It celebrates that fact. Like downtown Montgomery, there's a historic marker on 23rd Street that says that right outside the door. America's first bureaucracy. And so does that sound like an institution that's just, hey, bring me the latest idea, let's do something new? Not always the case. Now, that doesn't mean that the Secretaries of State don't want it to do a lot of other things, but it's got inertia the way I'm sure the Air Force has inertia as well. And one real challenge, in addition to all this tradition and history and the right way of doing things, and a lot of smart people who are have had to go through the most rigorous competitive exam in the US government to get in. Again, the smartest people are not always the first to take on a new idea. Because, why? Because they know what's going on already, all right? So there's a direct problem with that. But there's another cultural challenge, which is the risk component. How risk-oriented is the State Department? And this would probably be this is true of other sort of career-long bureaucracies. Risk can be a problem. So what I tried to do is, when I went around the State Department, I would say to people, I've got a virtuous scale. And a virtuous scale is that on this end, there's something really good. And on this end, there's something really good. And what I want to know is where you fall on this scale that I'm going to draw for you. So on this end, I would offer native caution. Sounds like a pretty good thing, doesn't it? That's how you keep from doing stupid stuff. Isn't that what native caution is? And on this end, American ingenuity. Sounds pretty good too, doesn't it? Isn't that how we get things done? We come up with clever ideas and solutions to complex problems. So I would ask audiences, I never had one this big at the State Department to ask, but I had one maybe a third this big. And I asked this question 2 months ago when I was there to talk about my book to about 75 people. And what I can report is that the answers have not changed in the 8 years that I've been asking the question. 95% of the State Department people said that the position of the State Department, native caution, American ingenuity, right here, right up against native caution. And guess where the other 5% of the wise guys think we are? So, I believe you need to have equilibrium. And what I like about virtuous scales is they're two good choices. It's not like good choice, bad choice. These are two good choices. But when people say that, and when they see the response of the State Department, they have the exact same response that you had. They laugh nervously because they know that there should be more of a balance, that you have to have both things if you're actually going to be effective in these war-torn places.
So with that, I think this is a good point, natural point to segue to question and answer. Do we have two students handling the mics? Let's open it up to as much Q&A as we can get in. And let me just quickly say, for those of you who aren't going into class afterwards, Ambassador Barton, Rick is going to be here at the edge of the stage if you want to have continued conversation. So please do ask questions.
And if I have trouble, I've got hearing aids, so I may or may not hear you. I may need your help here.
Okay.
Thank you, sir. My name is Major James Umar Ali from Uganda. My question is about diplomats taking over the work of military officers. In your presentation, you said the opposite. That is the military taking over the work of diplomats. And I want to drive you to the point of where you talked about Syria, where you said you talked to very many Syrians, and they were consistent in saying that stopping the bombing would give them nearly 100% chance of overrunning the Assad regime. It so happened that this was a question that we handled in our position paper for the midterm. But
send me the results.
yes,
I'll take all your papers.
yeah. So the ambassador, when the ambassador came to the U.S. and he said that he said the same thing exactly that you've said, that the Syrian people were waiting for the U.S. And what was the U.S. waiting for? The British were saying the same thing. We are ready. The French, their engine was in idle mode, waiting to strike. But for the Assad regime, he said, these are doctors, carpenters, cobblers, who do not have any experience in running, in even running a government. We have seen this same situation happen in Iraq, whereby the government in place was overrun, and then the country was turned into chaos. How sure are you that if the bombings were stopped in Syria, then there would be a smooth transition into a democratic government in Syria? Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you for your comment, and it is a really, really difficult situation. What I would say is there was a moment there in the Syria war. There have been two moments when the American public has really engaged. Does anybody want to guess when those two moments were? So 10,000 people were killed, 50,000 were killed, 100,000, 200,000. This is the American public's response. Same level of interest, up to about 500,000 now. But there have been two events that took us off the charts, where if you using just Google searches as your database, Google searches, two events. Do you know what those two events were? It's what? I'm sorry?
Chemical weapons.
Yeah, the red line. The red line, Obama saying the red line, and then bringing it to making a speech to the nation saying the red line has been crossed, but I'm going to go for congressional action. That average Americans, self-identified Americans said, 15% of Americans said they were following Syria. That was probably high. On the red line and the call for congressional action, within 2 weeks, 45% of Americans self-identified as being involved with this issue. And what I would say is this gets back to that tourist visa point I made before. We fought some fairly significant wars in this century, but unlike prior wars in American history, the last 20 wars the United States has been involved in, there have been no congressional votes. There have been general anti-terrorism, go ahead and do whatever you want kind of vote, but there haven't been, we are going to war votes. Last 20, that's sort of constitutionally mandated. Number two, there has not been a tax increase, and we've spent $3-4 trillion on these wars. It's been free. And number three, it used to be that 40% of American families had a direct connection to the U.S. military. Now it's less than 1%. So if your family's not involved, you're not paying for it, and your elected representatives don't have to vote on it, it's a tourist visa. And democracies don't work that well on tourist visas, actually. They actually require you to do more than just vote and pay taxes. You actually have to care about what's going on as well. Otherwise, it doesn't happen. When President Obama said that he was not going to do it unless there was a congressional vote, 85 members of Congress shortened their weekend to come back for a White House briefing because they might suddenly have a vote that mattered. Now, you can bet that many of them had press releases they probably had to tear up that they had prepared condemning the White House for taking us into another war without asking for their opinion. because they suddenly were on the line. What do you think the second blip was on that chart?
When we left.
What?
When we left.
Haven't really done that.
Was,
What? No, the little boy on the beach in Greece. How many people here have seen, are familiar with that? Yeah. Okay. So those two moments captured the American public. And getting back to whether diplomats are doing military jobs or military are doing diplomats' jobs, we both are great I've had the privilege of working with a lot of senior military people, and they are darn good diplomats and really good politicians, generally. I mean, they're highly skilled at making their way known. And good diplomats have got to be really familiar with your turf as well, because otherwise they use it way too casually. And generally, in most of the councils I've been in, the most reluctant people to use the military are the military leaders, which I find quite appropriate.
okay. Another question, please.
Yes, sir.
Yes, I'm Major Gary DeRazio, Flight 17, family medicine physician. I was wondering, with
Speak right into that mic if you will. Just thank you.
With the future threats of like biothreats and pandemics, in terms of the view of the military health system versus other local entities like other health services and NGOs, how do you view the military health service from a strategic imaging standpoint?
Well, it's hugely valuable, and it's really, again, you do have that agility and hopefully some liquidity to get into a problem fairly quickly. What I have found in the humanitarian world is, and I found this being in Rwanda right after the genocide, that we had all those people who had been involved with committing the genocide, living in squalor from Rwanda, having escaped from Rwanda. The people, the victims of the genocide, won the war, which is pretty upside down. And suddenly you ended up with 2 million people in Congo, and there was a huge cholera outbreak. Here you are in the middle of nowhere. There was a runway there, but within 2 weeks, the global humanitarian community pretty much contained it. Obviously with huge amount of help with lift and other things from the US military, but also the technical skills and the rest of it. So I think it's a great compliment. There are people but it should be a compliment, because at the end of the day, you really do want to do as much local capacity building as possible, as fast as you can, because that's really the only longer term answer. Otherwise you end up staying there or revisiting. So I value it highly. There are people in the humanitarian community that are very nervous about having the military involved with them, because they feel that it brings down, it creates a stronger identity, military identity than civilian identity, and also can oftentimes appear to be coming in on the side of whoever is governing in the place at that moment. I don't have that reservation, because I think the core commitment of the humanitarian community should be to save lives. And that doesn't mean we should leave them there as the humanitarian fig leaf, not dealing with the political outfall and the more complicated questions, but I think it has to be integrated. And this is a great asset, and you've got tremendous talent and real ability and advantages that nobody else in the world has. And when we've used those skills, as we did after the Pakistani earthquake, the United States had a positive rating in Pakistan of about like 15 or 18%. And when we went in and were visibly helpful with our military, because it was a huge national crisis after their earthquake, the view of the United States, for probably the only time in the last 20 years, was over half the people viewed us in a very favorable way. So there's the additional advantages. But it starts with doing something really practical and well and timely, and those are things that you can help help with and that you have helped with. Does that answer your question? Great, thank you.
Do we have another?
Sir, Major Michael Sorda, Flight 17. We've seen in a couple of lessons difficulties coordinating elements of national power within Afghanistan and other conflicts. A lot of the reason is different chains of command back to the Department of Defense and the State Department. How would you fix this? Would you look at strengthening the special envoy role or the centralized control of all those elements of national power at the regional level to kind of reduce some of the cross flow of ideas?
I mean, one of the questions that I ask people, and I would ask this audience as well, who is in charge of Afghanistan policy in the U.S. government? We've only been there 18 years. Anybody have a good, clear answer? I mean, some people say the president, but the president's got other things going on. And I doubt that he's running it 24/7. It doesn't feel like it. So, does anybody have a guess as to who's in charge? We even had a special coordinator at the White House for a number of years who was a former general, and Doug Lute was in charge of it for several years, but he had the disadvantage of being called a coordinator. Now, I had my first boss at AID when I was starting OTI said to me, never, ever, ever, did I say ever? Ever take a job as a coordinator. So he made an impression on me. Because the problem with being a coordinator is you may not have any say over who's on the team and where the money is being spent. Now, I don't know if you like to be in charge of situations and and the players don't report to you and you don't have any say on who's getting paid. You're counting a lot of goodwill. So even if you're sitting in the White House, that isn't necessarily the answer. So I think that what we need to do is move towards a one team, one leader, one policy, highly flexible spending. I mean, we spent $1 billion in the first year as the US government in the first year in Syria, and $900 million of that was for humanitarian assistance. And the other $100 million was for trying to help move the political equation a bit. When we presented that information to 15 people from all over the US government, they all went, really? We spent $1 billion already? And we spent 90% of it here? Maybe we should have spent more trying to actually change the situation. Now, the problem with Syria is within a few weeks of bombing, we can spend $1 billion like this. I mean, really quickly spend $1 billion. Doesn't take any time at all. So you have to have the ability and the authority to move that money to what is most needed and most effective. But if you don't have a cohesive team, a coherent plan, and you don't bring people together on a daily basis with a single leader, it's going to be really difficult to make that happen. I happen to believe that the selection of that leader, so that it doesn't always go back to the White House, should probably be done by the Secretaries of State, Defense, maybe the administrator of AID, in consultation within a few days of one of these crises unfolding. Because everybody sets up their own emergency reaction teams once they hear about it, but you're all off in your own buildings, feeding your own bureaucracies. And for example, the Defense Department was really reluctant to do anything in Syria. It paralleled President Obama's reluctance. Why? Because we were already into 2 wars, and a third war felt like it was going to be way over the top. We were pretty much exhausted by the 2 wars. So you have to have a coming together and a determination. And I don't believe that we necessarily need to be in as many places we are or as many bases as we have. There's a lot of things we could do that would be much more in keeping with the desires of the American people, I believe. But these things have a life of their own, and they sort of carry on. I know we probably only have time for another question or two, so. Okay, if you make this true or false, I'll hit it.
No, we may have enough for two. Please.
All right. Major John DeMello, Flight 36. So throughout our course, we've not only learned about employing air power, but how the warfare is changing with great power competition like China and Russia below the level of armed conflict. And we've also been learning that it's not just military power, but diplomatic and economic power. So as mid-career officers, we're getting that experience of understanding how that applies.
That's what I understand.
Do you see the same thing in USAID or the State Department or in other organizations that they're learning how we compete in gray zone conflict?
Well, thank you. I mean, that's why that's why both my office, which is now OTI is a darling of AID, when they go to Capitol Hill, they say, see how we can operate, even though it's still a tiny little boutique. But they use that as an example of it. And that's why this bureau was created at the State Department as well. So we would have a more professional understanding of what's going on. That doesn't mean that getting back to the earlier question, that the bureaucracies of either of those institutions immediately pick up on it. But what they do, if you do start to develop the talent and show your worth, and that was essentially the selling program that I had, then you do have real credibility in these places. So there's an awareness that among the rank and file that it has to be more relevant to these things. But the bureaucratic response is probably slower than it should be. But on the other hand, once you get your hooks into a place and you can show your value, my strategy at the State Department was that if I could find 5 crises that really mattered to the United States government, and I could convince the U.S. ambassadors and the assistant secretaries of the geographic bureaus of those places that I was bringing real value added, and I knew I had to have some liquidity. I knew I could buy almost any ambassador on earth for $1 million, so not a lot of liquidity, that I could really get the tentacles of this institution into this institution, and we could start to change this. But institutional change, as I'm sure all of you know, I mean, has anybody been in the Air Force here for less than 5 years? Okay, anybody, what's the middle point for this group, 15 years? 12. Yeah, okay. So, I mean, I could sit down with any 3 of you and I could probably get a pretty good articulation of some opportunities for progress in the Air Force. And that would be the same thing that I would say in the State Department. That was out there. It's there. It's waiting. And I hope did that answer your question? More or less? All right, well, feel free to come back for more.
And Lieutenant Colonel Jacobson has signaled we have time for one more
question.
Good.
Okay, great.
Yeah. If there's any
Make this one a true or false. Multiple choices, all right.
It's okay, sometimes we run over a little bit.
Yes, sir, over here. I'm glad you asked. I'm sort of leaning this way, so I'm sorry if I haven't.
All right, so I'm just looking for 2 people we can interact with. So at the operational and tactical level, really, a liaison. So the military tends to be ahead of the political objectives with our planning processes because we're, have the ability to do so. And so we sometimes get in front, our solutions go forward, and that's why we take over those diplomatic missions, maybe, because the military already has a plan for it. So at the tactical and operational level, who could we liaison with to get, some likely political objectives, or to make sure that we're probably on task with those, so we can incorporate them into our planning cycles?
Yeah. So one of the cultural weaknesses of the State Department, and it's not true on the country teams and in country. So if you're in country, if you're lucky enough to go into the country before you develop the plan here at Maxwell for the country, then you should be able to find people to link up with right away, because that is the sort of the culture of the country team. So I would say whether it's the political office, I mean, you obviously have a military attaché there as well. I mean, there are real opportunities. There's almost always an intelligence community representative, but you're really looking for that integrated team right at the beginning rather than just coming in through one person. Better not to just come in through the military attaché. In Washington, it's a heck of a lot harder, and the State Department is a harder place to get into. I could have a meeting with General Mattis because he knew that I would meet with him. You know, I mean, it wasn't like I was the answer. I mean, I had a little boutique over in the basement office of the State Department. So, and General Mattis could walk in pretty much any door, but they saw my door as being a promising door because I had the same interest. So you can always find someone, but it may not be as institutionally clear. And I would say that's probably true of the Defense Department. There are going to be people who are going to say, no way, no way, no way. And then there are going to be people who say, hey, let's talk about it. Let's see what's going on. But I would say you pretty much have to, if your interest is in the humanitarian space, that's very clearly defined. If your interest is in the geography of a place, that's quite clearly defined. There is a desk officer and a team that's generally set up. Their job is mostly to support the people in the country, but nevertheless, so there's some pretty clear avenues, and it would take probably 3 minutes with a conversation with somebody like myself to say, these are some doors we should knock on. And then if we're really lucky, we might get a group like CSO, the Conflict and Stabilization Operations people, to help convene a meeting with Ambassador Ford and some of the other people that are working on Syria, so you can get to meet the whole team at once. That's my ideal. I mean, I'd rather have it more structured, so it happens every time, and you don't have to go through this Where's Waldo exercise of figuring out what's going on in the U.S. government. But anyway, I hope that answers your question. It's not unintelligible. It just takes a little bit of work. And then you've got to be ready to knock on several doors. Here's a couple rules of thumb that I came up with. I worked for the Deputy Secretary of Defense when I was at former Deputy Secretary John Hamry at CSIS. He would say to get something done in the Pentagon, you had to be ready to say it 3 times. The first time people were kind of interested. The second time they thought, oh, he's still talking about that. And the third time he meant business. And I said to him, you are such a piker. At the State Department, you have to be ready to ask at least 7 or 8 times. Because they're all super smart people who think I recommend, I'll give Michael a link to a great article, Why Smart People Can't Learn, by the head of Yale's business school. And it's all those folks who, all their years in school, I'm sorry to report this is too true of me so I could figure it out, were the first people in elementary school when the teacher asked the question to raise their hand. It's like, that doesn't always pay off. That's not always the best thing to be, right? So anyway, I think that if you're ready to hear no, but you're going to keep searching, you're persistent, you are going to win. And we have to win if we're going to be better at these jobs. Okay. And that's why the American public is not hot on doing this kind of stuff. Because they say, hey, look at the last several of these that you did. It doesn't look like, you look like the Washington Redskins right now. That's not good. So anyway, I mean, there's an opportunity here.
Okay, well, thank you. Great talk. And Angela, I believe we have a gift for you.
On behalf of the Class AY20, we'd like to thank you for taking time out of your schedule to brief us on your experiences around the world and how to improve interagency operations.
Thank you. Thank you. My pleasure.